Chester Alan Arthur. The 21st President of the United States is primarily known for his mutton chop sideburns, but in the recent Netflix series Death by Lightning, viewers are treated to the incredible story of a machine politician who took over the presidency after the assassination of James Garfield and somehow transcended his corrupt past for the good of the country. Chester Arthur is widely viewed as a forgotten president, and perhaps this is why the producers of Netflix felt safe taking so many liberties with his portrayal by veteran comedy actor Nick Offerman. Indeed, of all the characters of the show, I felt the one who was least like the real person was Chester Arthur. So in this video, I'll be looking at Nick Offerman's Chester Arthur, pointing out some inaccuracies, and expanding on some of the things I thought the show got right. But for the sake of having a catchy title, this one's called Netflix Totally Botches Chester Arthur. And don't forget to drop a like and a comment. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do. This video is part of a series on Netflix's Death by Lightning, and if you like what you see, be sure to check out my previous videos on how the show dealt with the 1880 Republican Convention. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. Episode 2 of the series begins after James Garfield has been nominated by the Republican Party for president in 1880. Remember that Garfield was not even a candidate for the nomination and was chosen as a compromise between two warring factions of the party, so his rise to the top of the ticket was a total surprise. The issue of the day was whether to reform civil service, with one faction, the half-breeds, arguing for reform, while the other, the stalwarts, preferred to maintain the corrupt status quo, mainly because they controlled and benefited off this corrupt status quo. Garfield represented the half-breeds as well as the state of Ohio, which understood that in order to mend the party split and win the election, it would need to pick a candidate for vice president who represented the stalwarts, and perhaps more crucially, they needed to pick a candidate who hailed from the state with the most money and electoral votes in the country, New York. In the show, Garfield delegates are seen arguing over whom to choose as Garfield's running mate when James G. Blaine suddenly has the brilliant idea of picking Roscoe-Conkling's lieutenant, Chester Arthur. Now, if you haven't watched my first film, you may be wondering what the phrase Roscoe-Conkling's lieutenant actually means. In short, Roscoe-Conkling was a senator from New York City and the leader of the stalwart faction, and Arthur, the collector of the New York City ports, was his right-hand man. Throughout the first episode of the series, we see Chester Arthur roughing up convention delegates, even musing to Conkling that for chuckles, he may use brass knuckles. Arthur was known for a clever turn of phrase and had a witty limerick for many varied occasions. However, this violent streak is not something I encountered in any of the books I read about this man. To be sure, the stalwart faction Arthur represented was not above the use of violence, but Arthur had a reputation for leveraging his friendly personality, flattery skills, and access to the fine whiskey which came through New York City's ports, in order to get party members to bend to his will. In fact, he was widely known among New York Republicans as the gentleman boss, and his friends often complimented his constant affectionate smile. Now, it's important to make a caveat here. There's a lot about Arthur's life before the presidency that we simply don't know. That's because weeks before his death, he had the majority of his letters, journals, and personal papers burned. If they could somehow be restored, we might discover evidence of a much different, much darker version of the gentleman boss. But suffice to say that the brass knuckle-wearing mafia goon we encounter in the series doesn't line up with what history tells us about the future 21st president. Nevertheless, one thing the series does portray correctly is Arthur's redemption arc from corrupt boss to inspirational American president. And it all begins with the nomination to the vice presidency. In the series, the idea to nominate Arthur is shown to come from the mind of James G. Blaine, senator from Maine and influential half-breed Republican. In reality, Blaine was nowhere near the convention in 1880, but I discussed that in more detail in my previous video. The actual idea for nominating Arthur arrived far more randomly than the series shows. Shortly following Garfield's nomination, an Ohio delegate named William Dennison approached Roscoe-Conkling, asking if New York would choose a running mate for Garfield. Conkling, still annoyed that the Republicans had shirked his candidate, former President Ulysses Grant, stormed off in a huff. A few New York delegates standing nearby overheard this conversation and asked Arthur if he would consider taking the VP spot. Arthur agreed, but wanted to discuss the matter with Conkling first. The real conversation which ensued between Conkling and Arthur comes to us from a journalist who happened to be sitting on a couch in the room where it took place. The series does a pretty amazing job at capturing it accurately, but let's look at it more closely. When Nick Offerman approaches his boss, Conkling is sitting haughtily in a chair being shaved. It's a cool image that captures Conkling's personality, but the real Conkling was angrily pacing the floor of the room when Arthur came in to talk to him. Arthur did not mention his rudderless existence and grief over the death of his wife during the conversation as the series portrays, although he expressed these things as motivations for his desire to be vice president to other delegates. Great lines from the actual conversation are retained in the series dialogue, such as when Conkling tells Arthur to drop the nomination as you would a red-hot shoe from the forge, and if you wish for my favor and respect, you will contemptuously decline, as well as Arthur's assertions that the office of the vice presidency is a higher honor than I ever dreamed of obtaining. And Senator Conkling, I shall accept the nomination and I shall carry with me the majority of the delegation. Gives me chills every time. The final deviation from history in this scene is when Conkling screams at Arthur to get out! In the real story, it was Conkling who stormed out of the room. In the next scene, we see two candidates standing side by side as they greet supporters. Fun fact, the real Arthur was actually 2 inches taller than the real Garfield. Additionally, in this scene, Arthur makes the faux pas of wearing a Grant for President badge in front of his running mate, and yes, this did actually happen in real life. Up to this point, the series is fairly true to the original story, but from here on, things go a bit off the rails. First, we see a fictional planning meeting involving James G. Blaine and Chester Arthur. The two are discussing an upcoming Maine special election, which will serve as an omen for the coming presidential campaign. This is a true part of the story, and although Blaine assured the party he would deliver a win in Maine, he did not. In the series, Blaine takes responsibility for the loss, but in the real story, Blaine blamed the loss on election fraud perpetrated by Canadians who crossed into Maine from Quebec to cast votes for Democrats. The meeting is unceremoniously interrupted by Charles Guiteau, Garfield's future assassin, and while it is true that Guiteau often tried to push his way into campaign planning meetings and did interact with both Blaine and Arthur, it is unclear whether this specific scene occurred in real life. Perhaps the wildest fiction of the series occurs when Charles Guiteau, running from the police, scurries into a club only to bump into a blackout drunk Arthur at a party. The two spend the remainder of the evening in a bathroom where the future Vice President of the United States pukes his guts out. This is also the scene where Nick Offerman shouts, "Music! Fighting! Sausages!" While it is plausible to argue that Arthur loved music and sausages, there isn't any evidence he enjoyed fighting. What's more, Arthur was not known to be an out-of-control blackout drunk. To be sure, the man enjoyed his liquor, but was known to hold it well. A college friend of Arthur's once remarked, "He loved the pleasures of the table, and had an extraordinary power of digestion, and could carry a great deal of wine and liquor without any manifest effect other than greater vivacity of speech." These remarks are consistent with everything I read about Arthur under the influence of alcohol, and seem to fly totally in the face of what we see in the series. I guess Netflix thought it made for better TV. In any case, the bathroom conversation between Arthur and Guiteau serves to introduce a few truths about Arthur's biography, such as his sentimentality over the topic of his late wife Nell, and the fact that she was a vocal Confederate sympathizer. Nell Arthur came from a slaveholding family in Missouri and had many relatives who fought in the rebellion. Arthur, by contrast, served as New York's quartermaster for the Union, earning him the rank of general as well as the contempt of some of Nell's family. Nell's Confederate sympathies may have nonetheless had an impact on Arthur, who by some accounts became extremely critical of the Lincoln administration, going so far as to vote against his re-election in 1864. We don't see much of Arthur for a while after his run-in with Guiteau, until he's back at the New York port making peace with his boss Roscoe Conkling. Here, Arthur convinces Conkling that the vice presidency may provide the stalwarts a place from which they can steer Garfield away from his proposed reform policies. Conkling and Arthur did indeed make up during the campaign, but the series missed a great opportunity to tell the story as it actually happened, namely on a salmon fishing trip in Canada. According to Conkling, Arthur spent the entire trip bending over backwards to make sure everyone had a good time, and I would have loved to seen these two guys knee-deep in river waters with their poles and yucking it up over evening campfires and copious amounts of whiskey. In episode 3, we are treated to some more blackout drunk Chester Arthur as he stumbles around the inauguration ball cracking sausage jokes with Charles Guiteau. I guess Netflix thought viewers would be bored with the real Arthur, who was far more self-controlled in public, or maybe they just thought Nick Offerman as a drunk Chester Arthur was too funny to pass up. Either way, it's out of line with the historical sources. We next see Arthur in his office despairing over a list of Garfield's cabinet picks. Clearly, Garfield has chosen too many half-breeds who are going to push for civil service reforms. Arthur quickly springs into action, and we later see how he and Conkling kidnap Garfield's nominee for Secretary of Navy and threaten presumably to murder him if he accepts the position. Yeah, there's no way this actually happened. So the character here is not named, but looking closely at the list that so offended Arthur, I suppose this is supposed to be Levi P. Morton. Now, Morton here is portrayed as some sort of lackey who agrees to a post in Garfield's cabinet only to be intimidated into declining. For starters, Morton was not some random stalwart lackey, but one of the top guys in the New York faction at the time who had worked closely with Arthur to fundraise for the Garfield campaign, primarily by extorting donations from civil service workers. He was also a future vice president under Benjamin Harrison. Morton was pretty aligned with Conkling, and the reason he was in a position to accept a post in the administration at all was due to an agreement Conkling had made with Garfield during the campaign. Conkling had offered to put the entire New York machine behind Garfield in exchange for Morton's nomination to Secretary of the Treasury. However, according to Garfield's diary, Garfield did not believe he had ever agreed to any of Conkling's demands, and after his election, he refused to make Morton his Treasury Secretary, offering him the Navy Department instead. Conkling advised Morton to decline, and he did. I'm not sure why it was necessary to concoct this sort of Goodfellas-style fantasy around these events, other than to make the series more exciting. From this point, the series does a pretty good job depicting the biggest controversy of Garfield's brief presidency, namely the fight between Garfield and Conkling over the office of Collector of the Port of New York. This was one of the most powerful and lucrative federal offices in the country, and had been held by none other than Chester Arthur for 8 years. Arthur was fired by President Rutherford Hayes in 1878 during an extremely contentious battle. The series seems to imply that Arthur is still holding the office during his vice presidency. I'm not exactly sure. Now as vice president, he was hoping to place a Conkling loyalist at his old job. Unfortunately, Garfield nominated a half-breed by the name of William Robertson. The scene where Arthur shrieks at the list with Levi Morton's name on it would have been more accurate if he was shrieking at the list containing Robertson's name for Port Collector. It is true that this issue kicked off a war between Garfield and Conkling, and that Arthur sided with Conkling. The series later shows Arthur leaking negative comments about the president to a reporter, and this is close to a real story in which Arthur had encountered a reporter who was waiting to interview Roscoe Conkling and made some negative comments offhandedly about the president, which later appeared in print. In the same scene where Arthur is talking to the reporter, the series tries to draw an awkward parallel to January 6th by having Conkling urge supporters to march on the Capitol. Found that a bit cringy. After the newspapers print what Arthur had said about Garfield, the vice president approaches President Garfield with his letter of resignation in hand, which is another total invention of the series. Arthur never tried to resign from the vice presidency. What the series gets right, though, is that Conkling did in fact resign his Senate seat and apply to best Garfield, expecting that the Albany state legislature would unanimously re-elect him back to the post he had just given up. Side note, in those days, state legislatures, not voters, chose senators. Arthur accompanied Conkling to Albany and campaigned on Conkling's behalf, but to no avail. The legislature elected half-breed Chauncey Depew to Conkling's seat. Conkling's miscalculation not only killed his career, but proved a major embarrassment for Arthur. Afterwards, the two boarded a boat headed for New York City. As they sailed into the Canal Street port, an aide rushed to deliver the terrible news that President Garfield had been shot by an assassin. Receiving word that the president was still alive, Arthur stayed in Manhattan, hoping not to seem too eager to take over the presidency. Arthur was extremely disturbed by the thought of becoming president, especially under the horrific circumstances. However, I think the series exaggerates Arthur's panic, making it seem like Arthur was planning to ghost on his responsibilities to take over after Garfield's death. A scene showing Arthur abandoning a carriage ride with Roscoe Conkling and walking to the White House is touching, but appears to be completely made up. I would only note that the two did ride in carriages together during this time, and it is documented that Conkling was often heard bragging to Arthur about all the things the two could accomplish now that Garfield was out of the way and Arthur was in the White House, and that Arthur was apparently disgusted by the things his friend was saying. Arthur did return to Washington, D.C. in August of 1881 when Garfield's condition had stabilized and briefly visited both the president and the First Lady. The scene between Arthur and First Lady Lucretia Garfield has to be my least favorite in the whole series. Arthur is completely out of his mind, panicking about being president, until Mrs. Garfield slaps him in the face and shouts, "You read me effing well, Chester Arthur." I'm sorry, but Lucretia Garfield dropping an F-bomb? I don't think so. There was a lot of cursing in the series in general, which often took me out of the moment. Foul language certainly became more widespread among the Civil War generation. I mean, they spent a lot of time out there shooting and fighting, and they certainly cursed more than Americans that lived before them. But all the mother effer, sea sucker, twat, and all that just seemed over the top and made the series more like The Sopranos than a historical drama of the 1880s. Interestingly, one of Mrs. Garfield's lines in this scene is an actual documented historical quote, namely when she says, "Great emergencies can arouse long-dormant traits in men." However, it was not Mrs. Garfield who said this to Arthur, but a woman by the name of Julia Sand. Julia Sand was a handicapped woman from New York who was a kind of political junkie and Chester Arthur fangirl. When Garfield was shot, she began regularly writing the vice president letters, encouraging him to step up to the occasion, often with tough love. Arthur kept these letters and even visited Ms. Sand on one occasion. Scott S. Greenberg's book, Accidental President, argues that Ms. Sand served as a kind of conscience for Arthur throughout his presidency, urging him to transcend his checkered past and live up to the charge history had handed him. After Arthur had visited the White House, he returned to New York and was in Manhattan when he received news that Garfield had died. So the scene where Garfield is being wheeled out of the White House and tells a tearful Arthur he believes in him never happened. The series also shows a tearful James G. Blaine delivering the news to Arthur, also did not happen, then standing by his side as he takes the oath of office, presumably in Washington, D.C. The real story of Arthur's swearing in is far more interesting. Arthur heard the news of Garfield's death from a reporter outside of his Manhattan brownstone. Shortly afterward, a New York federal judge was summoned to Arthur's house, and he was sworn in as the 21st president in his living room at 2:20 a.m. Today, the site is home to a halal market containing only a small plaque referencing the swearing-in ceremony. In the final scene of the film, we are told that as president, Chester Arthur signed landmark civil service reform despite his history as Roscoe Conkling's bagman. This is true. Arthur really did turn against the machine that made him wealthy and powerful and ultimately governed for the whole country. Mark Twain thought he was one of our best presidents, though he may have been joking about that. But Arthur did a lot more than just that. He also signed the first major immigration law, the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act. He expanded the U.S. Navy, and he renovated an extremely dilapidated White House. Someday I'll do a video on his entire presidency, but this video will stick to what's in the show. As I said in my first video, I really liked the series. The fact that there are historical inaccuracies is totally understandable. Film crews and scriptwriters have a lot more concerns when making a show besides sticking to exactly what happened, especially considering historians don't always agree on every detail. However, I was disappointed that Arthur was shown to be a thug in the early episodes and would have preferred the more jovial, whimsical goofball that I fell in love with the first time I opened a president's book and saw those fancy outfits and mutton chop sideburns under the number 21. This might have made for worse TV, but it would have made me much happier. Otherwise, I'm frankly quite surprised with how close to actual history the series is. And as a YouTuber, I'm super excited and grateful that people are taking an interest in the Garfield-Arthur story. In fact, my last video broke all of my previous records on my channel, and I hope this one will as well. So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and watch my first one on Garfield's nomination for president. There will be a link for it at the end of the video. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.